Hi everyone, welcome to the IB Econ Guru weekly review live streams where I pick a different part of the syllabus and I review it. This is publicly available. However, you do have to become a subscriber to be able to chat with me. And obviously, before I begin, I would like you to look at the description below, see some ways you can support the IB Econ Guru, and I would encourage you to become a member of the channel. There are many exclusive perks for members. So let's get started. So today I'm going to be reviewing exchange rates. I'll also talk about something related to the balance of payments, the J-curve, and the Marshall-Lerner condition, because these do relate to exchange rates. But I won't actually talk about the whole balance of payments unit. That will be a separate live stream review. So first of all, let's define exchange rates. The exchange rate is the value of one currency expressed in terms of another currency. For example, 1 euro equals 1.5 US dollars. Okay, that's the definition. It's the value of one currency expressed in terms of another. So how do you put that on a diagram? So here you've got the price of the dollar in terms of euro, which is basically the euro per dollar. Okay, and then you've got the demand for the dollar and the supply of the US dollar. And then here you've got the quantity of the dollars. So price of dollars in terms of euros, quantity of dollars, demand for dollars, supply of dollars. Let's just first dissect or analyze what that means. First of all, the demand for the dollars in this case, because it's in terms of euro, the demand for the dollar comes from Europeans or Eurozone, so we'll call them actually not all Europeans, Eurozone citizens who wish to, four key terms to help you understand exchange rates, who wish to buy goods and services from the US, save in US financial markets, invest in the US, or travel to the US. Okay, so to the US. Okay, so any Eurozone citizen that wants to buy US goods and services is demanding dollars. Save or invest in US financial markets or travel to the US either for tourism, to study, or business is demanding the US dollar. What about the supply of the US dollars? This comes from US citizens or US residents, okay, who wish to buy goods and services from the Eurozone, save or invest in the Eurozone financial markets, or travel to any countries in the Eurozone, okay, to Eurozone countries. It's very important to remember that the demand for a currency comes from foreigners who wish to buy, save, invest, or travel, while the supply of a currency comes from the residents or the citizens of that country. These are the people that have the currency and they're willing to supply it. Now, why am I talking about Eurozone here? Because I am looking at the exchange rate of the dollar versus the euro. Okay, so remember, the demand for a currency comes from foreigners who wish to buy, save, travel, or invest. So the demand for the Egyptian pound comes from foreigners who want to buy Egyptian goods or services, save in Egyptian banks, invest in Egyptian financial markets, or travel to Egypt. Okay, while the supply of the Egyptian pound comes from Egyptians who wish to buy goods and services from overseas, travel overseas for tourism, education, or business, save or invest in overseas financial markets. This key distinction is very important. Okay, so you can see that here the equilibrium exchange rate is 0.67 euros, which means 1 US dollar in this case is equal to 0.67 euros. Now, if 1 US dollar is equal to 0.67 euros, then that means that 1 euro is equal to 1 divided by 0.67 dollars. Okay, and you can do the math here. You can flip it, right? Actually, now I'm curious. So 1 divided by 0.67 is equal to 1.49. So $1.49. Okay, so I talked about the demand and the supply, and I defined exchange rates. Okay, now in a floating exchange rate system, the value of the currency is determined through the forces of demand and supply. The demand for a currency comes from foreigners who wish to buy, save, travel, invest in this other country. And the supply comes from the residents who wish to buy, save, travel, invest overseas. If you remember those four key terms, by the way, the rest of this unit becomes very easy. Okay, so that's a floating exchange rate system. Now, in a floating exchange rate system, a currency could appreciate due to an increase in demand or appreciate due to a decrease in supply. It could also depreciate due to a decrease in demand or depreciate due to an increase in supply. Let's just first define those terms. So, an appreciation of a currency is when the price of a currency increases in a floating exchange rate system. Remember, appreciation only applies in a floating exchange rate system. In a fixed exchange rate system, we call it revaluation because it's deliberate. Okay, it's a product of government intervention. A depreciation is a decrease in the value of a currency in terms of another currency in a floating or a managed exchange rate system. Okay, by the way, appreciation can also be used in a managed, you can use that term when you're talking about a managed exchange rate system. Okay, so that's what an appreciation and depreciation means. Now, if the demand for the dollar increases, maybe because more Europeans want to travel to the United States, buy goods and services from the United States, or save or invest in the United States markets, that would cause the US dollar to appreciate against the euro. Okay? If the supply of the dollar decreases, that would also cause an appreciation. Maybe the supply of the dollar has decreased because less Americans are traveling overseas, buying from Eurozone countries or the European Union, saving or investing in Eurozone markets. Okay, so either an increase in demand or a decrease in supply would cause an appreciation in a floating exchange rate system. A depreciation is the opposite. There's a decrease in demand, maybe because Europeans are not demanding anymore. There's a decrease in demand by Europeans of US goods and services. They're buying less goods and services from the US. They're saving and investing less in US markets, or they are not traveling as much to the US. So there's a decrease in demand for the US dollar, or there's an increase in supply, maybe because suddenly COVID restrictions are removed. So more Americans are traveling to Europe. They're buying more goods and services from the EU. They're saving or investing. Okay, that would lead to an increase in supply. So here, this I got from the Eli Trigaki's textbook, which is a really good summary. All right, I'm going to talk about the factors that affect currency demand and the inflow of funds first. So an increase in currency demand, which leads to an appreciation, okay, this one here, an increase in currency demand, this one here, okay, could be due to an increase in foreign demand for exports of goods and services. So an increase in foreign demand for American exports, okay? Lower inflation leading to an increase in foreign demand for exports. Maybe the United States has a lower inflation rate than the Eurozone countries. So Eurozone residents are buying more American goods because they're cheaper. Higher growth rates of trading partners also leads to an increase in demand for exports. If there's a high growth rate in the Eurozone area, okay, more Eurozone residents will, see rise in incomes, and naturally they will buy more of everything, including imports from the United States. An increase in inward investment. Maybe lots of Europeans are finding it safer or more profitable to invest in US financial markets. Maybe the United States offers higher interest rates than the Eurozone countries. So more Eurozone residents would rather save in American banks. That would increase the demand for the US dollar. Maybe there's an increase of inflow of remittances. Lots of Americans live outside of America and they send money back home to their families or to save or to pay off their student debt. That increase of inflow of remittances increases the demand. Maybe speculators expect that the US dollar will rise, so they buy more US dollars, right? Speculation also affects the value of a currency. If speculators expect that the value of the US dollar will rise, that the US dollar will appreciate, they will buy more now so that they can sell it later at a higher price. okay, and make profit, okay? Or if the central bank decides to buy US dollars from the foreign exchange market. If the central bank buys a lot of US dollars, that also increases currency demand. What about a decrease in currency demand, which leads to depreciation? It's the opposite. If there's a decrease in foreign demand for US exports, okay, this would lead to a decrease in demand for the US dollar. If there's higher inflation in the US than there is in the Eurozone countries, so things in the US are becoming more expensive, right, will not buy as much stuff from the US, right? This will lead to a decrease in the demand for the US dollar. Low growth rates of trading partners. If the Eurozone area experiences a very low growth rate, okay, that will lead to a decrease in demand for US exports. They will buy less stuff from the US. Maybe there's a decrease in inward investment, maybe because there's political instability in the United States and people don't feel safe investing their money in the United States. So there's a decrease in foreign demand for the US dollar. Maybe there are lower interest rates in US banks, and that's leading to less inward financial investment. Okay. Maybe there's a decrease in the inflow of remittances. Maybe not as many Americans are traveling to live overseas and not sending as much money back home. Okay. So these are the factors that affect currency demand and either lead to an appreciation or a depreciation. Remember, if there's an increase in currency demand, this will lead to an appreciation. If there's a decrease in currency demand, this will lead to depreciation. All right, what about currency supply? Okay, so factors that affect currency supply, which is the outflows of funds. A decrease in currency supply will lead to an appreciation. It's this diagram here. A decrease in the supply of the US dollar will lead to an appreciation of the US dollar against the euro. What could lead to a decrease in currency supply? Well, maybe there's a decrease in domestic demand for imports of goods and services. Americans are basically not demanding as much imports from overseas. Maybe there's lower inflation leading to a decrease in domestic demand for imports. Maybe there's lower inflation in the US than the EU. So Americans are finding it actually cheaper to buy American goods and services than to buy from the EU. So basically, the lower inflation rate in the US will lead to the higher inflation rate in the Eurozone will lead to a decrease in domestic demand for Eurozone imports. Okay. Let me just, sorry, I'm trying to put my focus on so that I don't get notifications. Okay. Maybe there's low domestic growth rate leading to a decrease in domestic demand for imports. If the US economy is experiencing a recession in general, okay, Americans will not be demanding as much imports from overseas, which decreases the supply of the US dollars on foreign exchange markets. I can see you're all watching, by the way. Feel free to post in the comments. Feel free to post questions. If you have any questions, I'm happy to answer all questions. Okay? Maybe there's a decrease in outward investment. Maybe Americans are just not investing outside the US as much for whatever reason. Okay? Maybe there's higher interest rates in American banks, which leads to less financial investment by domestic residents in foreign countries. Remember, higher interest rates, okay, could lead to a decrease in currency supply and an increase in currency demand. Okay, if there are higher interest rates in the US than the EU, then more EU residents will want to save and invest in the US. That leads to an increase in the demand for the US dollar. And more American citizens will want to invest and save in the US, which leads to a decrease in the supply of the US dollar on the foreign exchange market. Maybe there's a decrease in the outflow of remittances. Maybe foreigners who are living in the United States are not sending as much money back home for whatever reason. There's a decrease in the outflow of remittances. Okay? Well, what are the factors that lead to an increase in currency supply, which leads to a depreciation? So it's this diagram here. Oh, these diagrams are flipped. I just realized. So this appreciation diagram is correct, but this appreciation diagram is correct. Sorry, this is the depreciation diagram. So this is the one where there's a decrease. Yeah, that's right. Okay, so what are the factors that lead to an increase in currency supply? This diagram here, which causes depreciation. Maybe there's an increase in domestic demand for imports of goods and services. Americans are buying more goods and services from the European Union, which basically leads to an increase in the US dollar, okay, in exchange for buying more euros, okay? Higher inflation in the US could actually push American citizens to buy more things from overseas where it's cheaper. So that leads to an increase in the supply of the US dollars on the foreign exchange market. High domestic growth rates in the US. When countries grow, their citizens demand more goods and services from overseas in general. Okay, so high economic growth in the US will encourage US citizens to buy more goods and services from both within the US and from overseas, right? Increase in outward investment. Maybe a lot of Americans are not sure about the returns on their investment in the US and they find better investment options in the EU. So they go and they invest in the EU, which increases the supply of the US dollar in the foreign exchange market. Maybe American banks are offering lower interest rates, so more Americans are actually um, going to invest in foreign countries. Lower interest rates will lead to a decrease in foreign demand for your currency and an increase of supply of your currency on the foreign exchange market. Maybe there's an increase in the outflow of remittances. A lot of foreigners living and working in the United States are not safe, don't feel safe leaving their money in the United States. They're sending them back home. There's an increase in outflow of remittances. Maybe speculators expect that the value of the currency will fall, so they go and they sell as much of it as possible now before the value falls. Okay, so if they sell as much of it now and then buy it later at a cheaper price, they've made a profit. Or if the central bank decides to sell the domestic currency. Okay, so if you look at these all, a lot of them are mirror images of each other. Okay, so make sure you can explain these factors. Make sure you use words like foreign and domestic. Okay, increase in foreign demand. Okay, make sure you specify when you're talking about exports versus imports. Is there an increase in foreign investment coming in or an increase of investment flowing out going to foreign countries? You need to be able to use these terms, okay, clearly. So these are the factors that would cause, remember, these are the causes of appreciation or depreciation, and they are all linked to demand and supply. Well, what about the consequences? Okay, so let's look at the other side. So consequences of appreciation or depreciation. Okay, all right, so this one's a little bit tricky because both of them can affect aggregate demand as well as aggregate supply. So I'm going to highlight a depreciation first. All right, first of all, a depreciation, so currency depreciation, may cause an increase in AD. Why? Because foreigners will demand more of your exports, so X increases, okay? While local citizens will not be able to afford as much imports, so M decreases. So currency depreciation can actually cause an increase in AD, which results in demand pull inflation. So here, I'm going to write, so depreciation leads to an increase in AD. Why? Because the foreign export revenue, foreigners demand more exports, so export revenue increases and import expenditure decreases. Therefore, AD increases. However, a depreciation can also cause a decrease in aggregate supply. A depreciation can cause an increase in aggregate demand or a decrease in short-run aggregate supply, or both. Why? Because a depreciation makes so the cost of imports of raw materials increases. So that raises the cost to production in a nation. So a very good example of this is Egypt. Right now, the Egyptian pound has been depreciated a lot because of the instability with the war between Russia and Ukraine and so on. This depreciation will increase foreign demand for Egyptian exports. That's one thing, and will decrease Egyptian demand for foreign imports. It will lead to, over time, an increase in AD, but it's also causing a lot of cost push inflation. Why? Because a lot of Egyptian industry relies on importing raw materials, and now that cost of raw materials has risen. So remember, a depreciation can cause both demand pull and cost push inflation. Just remember. So depreciation can cause, so the consequence of a depreciation may cause both demand pull and cost push inflation. And appreciation does the opposite. Okay, so let's change the color. And appreciation does the opposite. Appreciation makes your exports more expensive. So foreigners buy less of your exports. Export revenue declines and import expenditure increases because now your currency is stronger, so your citizens are buying more imports. Okay, so it can actually cause a decrease in aggregate demand and can cause an increase in short run aggregate supply. Why? Because now the costs of imported raw materials. Oh, sure. You're welcome. Absolutely. Make sure you rewatch the session afterwards. Have a good one. Bye. An appreciation may also cause an increase in short and aggregate supply because the cost of imported raw materials actually decreases. Okay, so remember, a depreciation may cause both demand pull and cost push inflation, while an appreciation may cause a decrease in aggregate demand and an increase in short-run aggregate supply. So that's the effect on aggregate demand and inflation. But let's also look here. A depreciation causes an increase in aggregate demand, okay, which means this is short-term economic growth. Short-term economic growth. A depreciation can actually increase aggregate demand and cause short-term economic growth, even if it causes demand pull inflation and cost push inflation, while an appreciation does the opposite, right? So an appreciation may cause a positive supply shock, an increase in short-run aggregate supply, but one of the consequences of an appreciation is there's a decrease in aggregate demand. So you should be able to talk about, just remember, a depreciation will shift AD to the right, and if the country is dependent on importing raw materials, it will also shift short-run aggregate supply to the left. Okay? That means it may cause short-term economic growth and create employment opportunities in export industries, but it may also cause demand pull and cost push inflation. So let me review here. Just so that you can see. So consequences of depreciation. These are all possible consequences. Okay. Number one, increase in AD, which means short-term economic growth plus increase in employment. So more jobs created in export industries. But demand pull inflation. So a depreciation may cause short-term economic growth and create jobs in export industries, but it may cause demand pull inflation. Another consequence is a decrease in short-run aggregate supply. Short-run aggregate supply shifts to the left, okay, which causes cost push inflation because raw materials imported from overseas are now more expensive. Okay, so you can see there are some positive consequences and some not so positive consequences. Okay, all right, what about an appreciation? It's the opposite. So consequences of an appreciation of your currency. Number one, a decrease in aggregate demand, which slows down demand pull inflation. Okay, but it's negative growth, right? And may create unemployment. All right, so it might slow down demand pull inflation, which is a good thing, but it might also lead to more unemployment. However, it also causes an increase in short and aggregate supply, especially if imported raw materials are cheaper, okay, which is basically a positive supply shock. and this creates more jobs, right? So make sure when you evaluate the consequences of depreciation and appreciation, you can look at the positive and the negative consequences in the short run as well as the long run. Okay, so you're looking at positive and negative effects of an appreciation or depreciation in the short term as well as the long term. Okay, so now let's have a look at a fixed exchange rate, the complete opposite. All right, when we're talking about a fixed exchange rate, we don't use the terms appreciation and depreciation anymore. Okay, we use the terms revaluation. A revaluation is an increase in the value of a currency in a fixed exchange rate system. It's not appreciation, it's revaluation. If the exchange rate system is fixed, you call it revaluation. And instead of depreciation, you use the term devaluation. A decrease in the value of a currency in a fixed exchange rate system is a devaluation. So how does it work? Let's assume number one, there's a fall in the demand for Boplin's exports, which reduces the demand for their currency, the Bopples. Okay? How can the central bank respond? Well, the central bank can then go and buy the excess Bopples in the foreign exchange market, which increases the demand for Bopples. Okay? By doing this, the central bank offsets the decrease in foreign demand for the currency. Okay? So if there's a decrease in foreign demand for the currency, the central bank enters the foreign exchange market and buys their own country's currency, buys the excess, so that offsets and brings the currency back to the fixed exchange rate here, which is 1.5. Okay. Well, another way is shifting the supply curve. Say there's a fall in the demand for Boplin's exports. Okay. The central bank can then go and decrease the supply of Bopples. The central bank can then go and take actions to decrease the demand for imports, which also decreases the supply of Bopples. So the central bank may use the government may use protectionist measures to basically reduce domestic demand for imports, which leads to a decrease in supply. The point is, if there's a decrease in demand for a currency, the central bank will offset that by either increasing the demand for the currency or decreasing the supply of the currency on the foreign exchange market to offset that. And this is what keeps the value fixed. That's the idea. Okay, so the central bank can either offset a decrease in demand for a currency by increasing the demand for the currency by buying excess Bopples, or the government could use protectionist measures to decrease the supply of the currency and reduce the domestic demand for imports. And the same works in the opposite. If there's an increase in the demand for the currency, this will cause the currency to appreciate. So to offset this, the central bank sells excess Bopples on the foreign exchange market, right, which increases the supply of the currency. So that's something to think about, okay? So in both of these diagrams, there's a fall in the demand for exports, causing a fall in demand for the Bopples, the domestic currency, hence a Bopple depreciation. In part A, the first diagram, the central bank buys Bopples, increasing the demand for the Bopples to its original level, hence maintaining the fixed exchange rate. Okay? Increasing the interest rate could do the same thing, by the way, or borrowing from abroad could do the same thing. In part B, the government makes efforts to restrict imports. So in this diagram here, the second diagram, the government makes efforts to restrict imports, thus decreasing the supply of their currency and maintaining the fixed exchange rate. Okay? This same diagram, both of these diagrams can be used to illustrate managed exchange rates. The central bank or the government take actions to change currency demand or currency supply in order to influence the value of the exchange rate. So the point is, to maintain a fixed exchange rate, the government has to offset any changes in demand or supply of the currency. If there's an increase in foreign demand for the currency, then you can either offset it by decreasing the demand for the currency or increasing the supply of the currency. If there's a decrease in foreign demand for currency, you can offset that by increasing the demand for the currency or by increasing the supply of the currency. Okay, so that's something you need to think about. Now, I don't really want to talk about the balance of payments, but I do want to talk about the relationship between exchange rates and the balance of payments. Okay, so remember, a surplus on the current account will cause appreciation. Why? Because if there's a current account surplus, that means there is strong foreign demand for your currency. Okay, a current account surplus means there is strong foreign demand for your exports, which basically means there's strong foreign demand, foreign demand for your currency. So a current account surplus will cause an appreciation. Okay. And remember, an appreciation is not always a good thing, right? Because remember when I said here, an appreciation leads to a decrease in aggregate demand, which slows down demand pull inflation, but creates negative growth and may create unemployment. An appreciation, however, may also increase short run aggregate supply because it makes imported raw materials cheaper. The point is, an appreciation is not always a good thing, and a depreciation is not always a bad thing either. Okay. So a current account surplus will cause an appreciation, and a current account deficit will cause a depreciation. Why? Because a current account deficit means there is lots of domestic, there is strong domestic demand for imports, which means there's lots of supply of your currency in the foreign exchange market. Okay, so a current account deficit means that the supply of your currency increases, which causes a depreciation. So a current account surplus means there's an increase in the demand for your currency, which causes an appreciation. Current account deficit means that there's an increase in the supply of your currency on the foreign exchange market, which causes it to depreciate. Okay, so part A shows when there's a current account surplus, the extra demand for the currency is likely to exert an upward pressure on the value of the currency or cause appreciation. While part B shows that when there's a current account deficit, the extra supply of the currency is likely to cause a downward pressure on the value of the currency or depreciation. So in the case of a current account surplus, there is extra demand. In the case of a current account deficit, there is extra supply of your currency. Okay? This is a high level only concept. I just wanted to talk about the Marshall-Lerner condition and the J curve, which is a higher level only concept. So if you're standard level, you don't need to watch the rest of this video. Okay. Now, lots of countries use currency depreciation or currency devaluation to fix a current account deficit. Why? Because ultimately, so a currency depreciation or devaluation, both are the same thing. It's a decrease in the value of the currency. Means that exports become cheaper and imports become more expensive, right? So this would actually, if exports become cheaper, could, not always, could increase foreign demand for exports and thus increase export revenue. And if imports become more expensive, it could decrease domestic demand for imports and thus decrease import expenditure. However, that depends on elasticity. In the short run, demand is very inelastic. So what's going to happen when you depreciate or devalue your currency is that in the short run, your domestic citizens are going to continue buying imports. So what's going to happen is your import expenditure will actually increase first. And then in the long run, when the demand for imports becomes more elastic, import expenditure will decrease. The same with export revenue. Because in the short run, demand for your exports is inelastic. Now that exports are cheaper in the short run because demand is inelastic, your export revenue is actually not going to increase. It's probably going to decrease, right? Because demand is inelastic. But in the long run, as demand becomes more elastic, your export revenue will. So the point is, this could increase foreign demand for exports and lead to an increase in export revenue, but this is more likely to happen in long run than short run, both of these. In the short run, your import expenditure will actually increase and your export revenue will actually decrease. But in the long run, because demand becomes more elastic, that's when this happens. And this is essentially the idea of the J curve, okay? Is that if you have a trade, so let's look here. If you have a trade deficit, that's your starting point. That trade deficit is likely to get worse in the short run okay, because export revenue actually decreases, okay, and import expenditure actually increases. And then in the long run, it slowly begins to improve. Why? Because export revenue starts to rise and import expenditure starts to fall, okay? Because demand becomes more elastic in the long run, while in the short run, demand is highly inelastic. Something to think about, okay? So this is a trade deficit at the time of devaluation or depreciation. And if the value of exports is equal to the value of imports at time of so say um, you start with value of exports and imports are equal. What's going to happen is, once again, there'll be a trade deficit in the short run if you depreciate or devalue your currency, followed by a trade surplus in the long run. Okay, so trade deficit in short run because the foreign demand for your exports is inelastic, and domestic demand for imports is inelastic, while there will be more likely be a trade surplus in the long run as foreign demand for your exports becomes more elastic and domestic demand for imports becomes more elastic. Remember, you cannot score highly on questions related to global economy without making sure you're using the words foreign and domestic correctly, and you're using the words exports and imports correctly, and you're using the words export revenue and import expenditure correctly. You need to really distinguish between exports and imports, foreign and domestic, revenue and expenditure. You need to learn how to use these terms correctly. Okay, so the J-curve effect follows the Marshall-Lerner condition that is unlikely to be satisfied over short periods of time, while it is more likely to be satisfied over longer periods of time. The figure shows how a current account deficit increases following a depreciation or devaluation, which over time begins to improve, turning into a current account surplus. The point is, if you are experiencing a current account deficit and you decide to depreciate or devalue your currency, this deficit will get worse in the short run before it gets better. And that's why it looks like a J. We call it the J curve. Okay. And that's it. I just talked about exchange rates, fixed and managed and floating, the causes of changes in the exchange rate, and the consequences of changes in the exchange rate. Remember, a depreciation is not always a bad thing. It has positive as well as negative consequences in the short run as well as in the long run. Remember, an appreciation isn't always a good thing. It has positive as well as negative consequences in the short run and the long run. And you need to be able to evaluate both. Okay. Um, and then I talked about the effect of a current account surplus. Remember, a current account surplus means there's excess demand, extra demand for your currency, which might cause an appreciation. While a current account deficit on the balance of payments means there's extra supply of your currency in the foreign exchange market, which might cause a depreciation. And I talked about the J curve, which is a high level only concept. So I'm pretty much done with what I had planned. I hope you guys found this useful. Obviously, please feel free to become a channel member if you want to support this channel. There are actually practice questions on exchange rates and the balance of payments, and the members are in the area. I've got practice questions from the global economy unit, from microeconomics, and from macroeconomics. Lots of real world examples, lots of great content for members. So become a channel member. The link is in the description below. Like, share, comment, subscribe every week at 2 p.m. GMT. Today was a little bit earlier because I had unforeseen circumstances, but every week at 2 p.m. GMT, I'll be running a live session to review a different part of the syllabus. Pay attention to the communities tab. That's where I post the community tab. That's where I post the poll so that you can vote on the topic for each session. It's been great sharing this with you again. And yeah, have a great rest of your weekend and goodbye. Bye.